Good evening, everyone. It's Ken Kim. Hope everyone's having a great weekend. I'm uploading a video on a recap of the 2024 elections. So this is going to be a three-part series. The first one is going to be going over the House and Senate elections, but then part two will be going over a specific Senate election, and number three will just be going in depth more about other Senate elections as well. So going into 2024, it was looking to be a red-leaning environment. So I'm getting a lot of this voter registration data changes from Decision Desk HQ and just comparing. And so we see after the 2020 election to heading into the 2024 election, we see that on the top, Democrats to bottom lost over 3 million registered voters, while Republicans actually gained about 141,000 voter registration across the 50 states. So that did signal that it was going to be a red-leaning environment just because you had a shift of over 3.5 million voter registration trends. And also, two independents did go up as well. And then you look at the voter registration trends on this chart as well from July 2024, for example. You see that most of the states here, you have more registered Republicans than registered Democrats across many states, whether it's red, blue, or even purple states. It's very rare for any state, for like example, Delaware, where you had Republican losses, but then Democrat gain. And for starting off, I wanted to go over the congressional assessment. And so the first thing I want to talk about is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, because you may have noticed that there were some states that had to redraw their maps while others got away with gerrymandering. And that was partly because the South was more susceptible to the 1965 Voting Rights Act just because they wanted equal representation of black congressional districts and make sure blacks were not gerrymandered out of certain representation. And so that's why Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, for example, had to redraw their maps, while states like Illinois were able to remain gerrymandered. And what I mean by that is Georgia, for the most part, actually had a very reasonable map from the get-go. And then when you look at the left to right for the Illinois map from Ballotpedia, you see that on the left was Illinois' original map. It's not the prettiest, but at least you see some sort of block shapes. But then on the right, after it got approved, you see that they essentially just pretty much squeezed out parts of like western and southern Illinois. And they also drew the maps to include big cities and just very barely a little bit of the rural areas. And they split Chicago between more than 10 congressional districts. And that's because they wanted to make sure in this map that they made a lot of the partisan leans for the Democrats more favorable. So instead of having a bunch of swing congressional districts, now it just became like a heavier partisan lean for the Democrats. And the Democrats weren't the only ones guilty of this. You see on the right, you have Illinois, but then in the center, you have Texas. And on the left, you have Ohio. These are more examples. Republicans were just as guilty of gerrymandering as well. And I want to talk about why the gerrymandering is not necessarily a good thing. So Georgetown actually did a study talking about how in the 1800s there was an average House turnover rate of 45% per election. Today that'd be over 200 seats flipping per election cycle, which is kind of crazy to think about. But with more gerrymandering, this is leading to more safe seats, translating to more incumbents staying longer in politics. And you can make an argument that it's leading to more bureaucracies. And as a result, because of this, that there's more incumbents, there's more incumbents that are less likely to reach across the aisle because they're in such a safe seat. And as you can see here on the right, you see that in the 2020s and even the 2010s, you really ever see like some crazy house flips. Like you had one for say the first time Trump was in office in 2018, and you also have one for when Obama was in office in 2010. But as you can see now, it's with more and more gerrymandering and congressional redistricting, it's making less and less competitive House seats. For sure, and with the way the maps are drawn, you're not going to see anywhere close to 200 House seats like in the 1800s flip on a consistent election cycle. You'll be lucky to see if maybe 50, 60 House seats now with the way a lot of these maps are drawn. And we see an assessment here. So Democrats flipped 3 seats in California, 4 in New York, 1 in Oregon. There was 1 seat each in Alabama and Louisiana that flipped because the new congressional maps in those states had to have black representation because of the Voting Rights Act. And Republicans picked up 3 seats in North Carolina because of the state's new congressional map. Republicans also flipped 2 seats in Pennsylvania, one in Michigan, one in Colorado, and finally Alaska, because they weren't running two GOP candidates this time just because of the ranked choice voting system. So overall, despite it being a red-leaning environment, Democrats overall gained 2 seats despite all of this, just because of how a lot of these seats were drawn very differently from even like 2022. And you look at this, the House seats carefully in like these scenarios. A good chunk of these such flips were not because necessarily of candidate quality, but it was more or less just situational. For example, Alaska and having to redraw the maps for the Voting Rights Act, and then also to a little bit of gerrymandering as well kept some seats like not as flippable. And now we're going to go over the Senate map of 2024 to 2026. As you can see on the left, in the dark red is the Republican gain, and then in the light red was already a Republican hold, and in the blue map is Democrat gain, and light blue is Democrat hold. In 2024, the Democrats already had a very susceptible map just because it was looking to be a red-leaning environment, and then not only were they trying to hold off 3 seats in which Trump had already won by a safe margin, Ohio, West Virginia, Montana, but almost all swing states had Senate seats up for re-election as well, in Nevada, Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And in 2026, I'll be honest, it's going to be very difficult for the Democrats to try to regain the Senate, just because, even if they hold on to Georgia, they hold on to Michigan, they flip Maine, they flip North Carolina, they only get to 49 Senate seats. So they would need to flip 2 more. And at that point, they would need to start flipping solid red seats. So they may have to flip like in Ohio, Iowa, Texas, Florida, or Alaska. And at that point, it's just how strong is a partisan lean still in those states, just because it's going to be an uphill battle for sure, just because of how much the prior election, where a lot of these states voted over 10% for Trump. So it's very possible that this is going to be very unrealistic for them to take back the Senate in this election cycle year. And I want to go over like how spending was done. So Democrats versus Republicans. So on the top, you saw the Democratic advantage for spending on Senate races, and you see the GOP advantage for Senate races spent. So Democrats outspent the GOP in Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Montana, and Florida for those Senate races. And the GOP outspent the Democrats in only 4 states, in Texas, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Ohio. So I'm a little kind of bamboozled how the GOP spent so much money on Maryland. And in my opinion, I don't think Maryland was a winnable Senate seat to begin with. Just the fact like how I thought Florida had just gotten so red leaning, in the sense that Miami was starting to shift very Republican. Same thing with Tampa the last few election cycles. So I think the Democrats were kind of in over their head with Florida. And if you look at the next uh, map over, or not map, chart over here, we see that the GOP, the most money they spent on a Senate race was Ohio, Pennsylvania, then Montana, and Maryland they spent more money on Maryland than Arizona and Nevada, which is kind of surprising. And they spent almost the same amount of money on Maryland like they did Wisconsin. And to be frank, if they had spent less money on Maryland and had spent more money on Wisconsin, Nevada, and Michigan, they most likely could have won those Senate seats and gotten a few more flips. And even Ohio, even though the polls had Moreno losing to Sherrod Brown, I kind of figured, and I'll explain more in my later video, that Moreno was probably going to pull it off, just because Sherrod Brown, even though he was a 3-term incumbent, he had never gone up against Trump, in the sense that a Republican that was winning Ohio by almost 10 points. So the rest of the potential flips, Ohio, West Virginia, Montana, I think the GOP really benefited from having Trump at the top of the ticket, just because he was winning by bigger margins. And the swing state potential flips, Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, they only flipped 1 out of the 5. And ironically, Pennsylvania was the one that was seen as the strongest incumbent, which was Bob Casey, who him and his dad had won consecutive elections in the state of Pennsylvania by large margins. But yes, so now my next video, I will talk about why the Maryland Senate race was not as winnable for the GOP.